We're hosting a series of four uh, conversations, really, about race. The first tonight is going to be entitled Why Did We Walk? And we're going to talk about the walk against racism that happened on June 6th in Winnetka. And then we're going to tie that into a question around who is welcome here and who is welcome on the North Shore.
I was witnessing what was happening around the country as everyone else was, and especially in urban centers. And I felt like a lot of my friends from the area felt the same way that I did, that like we felt very passionate about the Black Lives Matter movement, but we didn't see it present in this community in Winnetka. We didn't see it as something that a community was thinking was part of our story. And so we wanted to give a platform both to talk about how Winnetka is a part of this greater issue of racial inequity in America, and also give a platform for Winnetkans to come together, because we thought people did want to be able to engage in this dialogue and show solidarity with the movement. And as evidenced by the really large turnout that I think surpassed all of our expectations, that was true, that people did indeed want to engage with this subject. I think that there are a lot of really powerful people in Winnetka. It's a place where there's a lot of power because there's a lot of wealth. And I think there are important people in that crowd. And also there were a lot of multi-generational representation in that crowd. So that was both promising in the sense that people who hold a lot of power in our community and honestly in the greater country were able to listen to some really powerful speakers and statements. And also the fact that entire families were showing up. You know, my hope was that this was an event that sparked dinner table conversations going forward and people reaching out to their extended family. And I think that did happen because of that.
So you mentioned the speakers, and I totally agree. They were just incredible. What message did you take away, or what messages did you take away from some of the speakers?
I think all the speakers were super powerful, but I think that we can all be in like a pretty sure agreement that the student speakers were perhaps the most powerful, because one, our student speakers were the only speakers of color who spoke, and they were able to give voice that racism does exist in this community, that people of color do exist in this community, whether or not they're that visible. And also I think hearing from the youth is always powerful, especially when there are older generations in the crowd. And they didn't try to make anyone comfortable. And that's what I really appreciate, was that this wasn't a space for white Winnetka to be patted on the back for showing up. This was a space for people in Winnetka to come out and realize that racism is a problem in Winnetka, that Winnetka isn't white, predominantly white by coincidence. So I'm super excited to be continuing this conversation, because that's what needs to happen for change to happen.
And that was a great segue, I think, to the theme for tonight, which asks us whether or not Winnetka, and frankly the North Shore, because I know we've got plenty of Wilmetters, some Northbrookers, maybe some Northfielders on tonight. Is the North Shore welcoming for everybody? And another way to phrase that is, who is welcome on the North Shore?
But let me say something about my coming to the North Shore. It really had nothing to do with the feeling like I would be alone as a Black man in the North Shore. I had been to Wilmette many times because I'm Baha'i, and I'd been to the Baha'i House of Worship. And when I was asked to come there to be the music director, I didn't have any hesitation. But the first thing I ran into was where I would live. I wanted very much to live near the Baha'i House of Worship. And so I was looking in Wilmette. I looked in Northbrook. I looked as far out, I thought, as Winnetka, Highland Park, and I thought those were too far. So I was trying to be really close to the House of Worship. not really knowing, and really kind of naive. And as I was thinking about what I might say tonight, you know, in our history, Black people moved from the states just under Illinois in the Great Migration, coming to Chicago, thinking Chicago would be the promised land. And they found out it wasn't. I thought when I came to Chicago, it was a progressive city. All of its suburbs will be welcoming. And I didn't even know that it was kind of difficult to find a place to live. And I didn't associate that with being African American. I just thought it was hard to get a place to stay. And I looked at a number of places, and I finally moved to Wilmette from first Evanston and then Wilmette. I didn't find out until after I moved in. My realtor said, you know, this is unbelievable. This is the first time we've ever been able to show this to a person who is Black.
Wow.
And I said, what? I live in Wilmette in a neighborhood where there are just two homes with Black people in it. And I've been here 13 years. Now, I haven't seen anything that welcomes me to the North Shore. You know, it had to be something you just want to do. And I wanted to do it initially because it made me close to work. But I found out that it requires something that all my years living in the South and in segregated America, I had never experienced the loneliness of color. I pulled this out. This is it says everybody wants freedom. I was in college, my third year in college, and we made this CD. It was right in the time of the sit-ins in Greensboro, North Carolina. And so I knew a lot about demonstrations because I sat in. I knew a lot about having to stand up for rights. And sometimes that wasn't a popular thing to do. But I hadn't envisioned that I'd have to do that 50 years later in the North Shore of Chicago. And so all the time I've been here, I have not really been where I see a lot of people of color. I'm usually the only one in a meeting. And you know, that says something. I recently looked under affordable housing in the North Shore. All I could find was what I suspected wasn't affordable housing, but was housing for elderly and for white. And so all the people who talked about how wonderful the housing was white ladies, old white ladies. And I thought, now, if we do want to integrate the North Shore, what are we doing to reach out to other people who have learned from way back that this is not a place for us?
All right, our next speaker this evening, I met recently. He sadly just moved out of Winnetka to Evanston, but I think is expecting an expansion to his family, so he's got that to look forward to. I want to introduce you to Victor Emanuel. Victor, are you on?
Yes, I am.
Fantastic.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
My,
You know, in a similar vein, I'd just love to hear your perspectives, your reflections, and your thoughts on living in Winnetka for 7 years.
Sure. First of all, thank you, Patrick, for first organizing such a thing. While this was going on, my wife and I, we were sitting by and watching, you know, the entire country come together, and wondered if this community would step up. And Grace, I don't think we've met. I think you've met my wife, Cece. She speaks very highly of you. But it was amazing to see the young people of Winnetka take on this initiative. And I see you guys as the future and as those that can be leaders and can set the tone for those that might be hesitant to make a progressive step. So congratulations on having the strength to step up and show up for those that can't. So as for the context of how I got into Winnetka, I think placement is important, how you find yourself there. Much like Van, I have not really much experience with the US before entering. And the first place I went into was Winnetka, and that was absolutely by coincidence. I had no prior knowledge of what Winnetka was or was on the map. I used to actually, I was a resident of Canada, and I was working in the Middle East when I met my wife, who is from Winnetka. And that is the context for how I ended up coming to Winnetka. Her family is there. So I ended up eventually moving from UAE, and we wanted to start a life, and we figured we'd move in with the in-laws, and that would be our first step, in terms of starting a new life in the US. And interestingly, Winnetka at first glance coming in from Canada and the UAE is beautiful, just as its name. It is a beautiful place, and at first sight, it's you feel that you're around an environment that is secure, safe, comforting in its appearance. And I figured that my relationships there would grow as I continue to be part of that community, and over time, people will see me, and I assumed that those natural connections would happen, and they didn't. And I started realizing how the community and the dynamic work and where I was, because I didn't situate myself initially. I didn't know how I would fit in there. But slowly I started to realize America at large is very divided. And I was put into a situation where I am very much an outsider coming in. And there is no context for why I would be there, aside from if someone was to actually get to know me and figure out why I got there. So what ended up happening, being in that community, I started forming relationships with most of the people that would be servicing the community by frequenting the establishments there. So going to True Juice or going to Starbucks people started realizing, oh, I'm around here, I'm always there. And they started embracing me. While most people that I feel that come into contact, I think have a hard time finding why I would be there, because most time in that community, I find either you're there because you're servicing that community in some capacity, or you are there because you need to do something. There would be no reason other than that for a person to just come into Winnetka and hang out. Mm-hmm. And that's where I find the people are not as welcoming, because they have placed it as a situation where if they see you, they're not sure why you are there, because you're not in a capacity that they can understand for a man of color to be there. And I'm walking around having coffee, sitting at parks, and walking my dog. And interesting enough, I didn't have a comparison, because I never lived anywhere else in the US until we moved. And I said, you know what, and eventually it does becoming tiring, because you want to be part of the community. Especially once you start living there for a while, you would think, okay, people would say, hey, welcome to the neighborhood. I have been there for 7 years. I have walked my dog many, many, many times. And I have had people who've looked and said hi, but have never welcomed me into the community. I have lived in Evanston for less than 3 weeks, and I've had more people say, welcome to the neighborhood, not even knowing that if I am even part of this neighborhood. They're like, hey, oh, welcome to the neighborhood, because they assume I'm walking my dog, and they've seen me more than once that I'm part of this neighborhood. And that kind of shows the acceptance rate in the people that live in Evanston to those that live in Winnetka.
Yes. Well, like Gail said, it seemed very short. We were kind of mid-conversation, but I think we had 4 members in our group, and I think that we talked about how the community seems welcoming from the perspective of our experience, and we would like to think that most are welcoming, but the reality is, you know, I touched on the fact that I grew up here, and in my graduating class at New Trier, I think there were 2 Black students, and I always kind of thought that would evolve over the years and that the diversity would increase. But if you look at where we are today, it hasn't. And so I think we need, and we talked as a group, how we need to look at how do we make that change and how do we become a more inclusive community. And we touched on affordable housing and the fact that Winnetka and many of the neighboring suburbs have not submitted plans, and that's something that's been going on for years. And so I think as a community, we really need to figure out ways to become intentionally inclusive and welcoming.
Yeah,